Done record. There we go. So I trust it better when I'm recording to the computer rather than to the cloud, because I find when it goes to the cloud, sometimes if there's any sort of time delays or what have you, there can be some hiccups. Plus, we don't have the kind of storage, like, for how long we're going for this to make it worthwhile. So I download it here, and then I will upload it to the YouTube channel. Well, welcome everybody to Reclaiming Revelation, and this is just the first week that we're going to be going into, just getting into it. And tonight is an introduction and overview, but the reality is because of the complexity of the subject matter we're dealing with the book of Revelation. In fact, week 1 and week 2 are effectively an extended introduction before we even dive into the text. Mostly because I need to give you some background working information on this. One of the commentaries that I work with that really helped me a lot is from a commentary called from the interpretation series called, appropriately titled, it's Revelation, by a biblical scholar with the unfortunate name of Eugene Boring. And he's anything but. But his book, the introduction is 70 pages long, because it needs to lay all the groundwork. So that's a lot of what we're doing today. So as we get started, let's say a short prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for your presence with us tonight, for giving us a sense of guidance of where we are to look when studying this strangest of books when it comes to the Bible. And yet we come with a spirit of learning, wanting to discover and come to a new understanding, if we can, of something that many of us find strange or even fearful. And yet it is not to be feared. You always say to us, do not be afraid. And so help us to learn something new tonight, we pray. In Christ's name, amen. All right, so just what I wanted to do first is kind of give you a little bit of an overview. I've done this before in studies that I've led, in terms of the different types of Bible study that one can get into. And even though you may not necessarily recognize them as such, one of these styles probably resonates with how, if you've done studies before, as to the different types. One, called Lectio Divina, is simply reading and reflecting and then responding to it, and then just it's very much a meditative, devotional style of reading. The Ignatian method is, it engages the imagination, and it also tries to get you to identify with characters. What would have been like for Zacchaeus in the tree, for example, or listening to Jesus proclaiming the parables. The Ignatian method is one that works in that format. And of course, quite often, if you follow a devotional style of set of readings, this is probably more where you're at. What we're going to be working with is, again, this is where here my biases are out front. But also with working with Revelation, you almost have to enter it from this point in time, because you might get lost in the weeds if you try go with the other methods. So the reason that I'm doing this is so that it gives you some grounding, so that in coming back to any of the different methods or methods beyond what are listed here, that it gives you kind of a grounding of which to work with. So largely tonight is a scholarly approach to working through Revelation. We do get into some of the weeds. For those of you who took who were part of the evolution of the Bible, there are going to be elements tonight and sort of and little bits throughout the whole thing, because I did one whole night on Revelation, and whereas this, of course, we're doing this over seven sessions. So I'm going to get into, here's what those 7 sessions are going to look like. Today is basically just a first look. Some of it, like, although there's a very important aside that we're going to kind of tackle up front of some of the types of exposure that you may have had to the book of Revelation, and I want to kind of grab onto that initially and then set it aside. You'll see what I mean, and then getting into some of the who, what, where, when, why parts of Revelation tonight. And that's today. Next week, we actually start looking specifically into the broad categories of the symbols or the symbolic language that is present not only in Revelation itself, but broadly in a kind of a category of literature that really doesn't exist anymore. I mean, there's a couple of notable exceptions where that may be the case. But looking at the term apocalyptic literature and what that means, and it is not as scary as you might think it might be. Because of course, when you hear the word apocalyptic, you think of something rather destructive and scary, and what have you. And I'm hoping to deconstruct some of that. Now, week 3 is actually when we dive into that. We're going to go into the opening part, looking at the letters of the 7 churches, the rhythm, the flow, the pattern of that, and also where these churches happen to be, because there's also something interesting about that. And then we get into the different groups of 7 in this kind of cyclical format of 7 groups of scrolls, trumpets, and bowls. And then on November 22nd, actually, that's not true. I need to wind this back. These dates are not correct, because next week is November 1st. The letters to the sorry, let me I need to wind this back. I have to double check when I'm on study leave, but I think I'm actually on study leave on the 15th, and I'm back on the 22nd. I need to verify. I'll have those dates correct next week. But like somewhere in the middle of this, we have I'll be on study leave. Week 5 is we're pulling back the curtain. And this is the core of Revelation. It is probably the material that is the most lurid, the most weird, but it's also it also has a certain power to it that is really worthwhile. It's in some respects it's the core message. Then we get into more the ending of the book itself, into this vision of hope. And then lastly is, okay, now that we've gone through all of this, now that we've done this, what is a responsible way to interpret Revelation? And that's largely the last session, which is, and it says November 3rd. My dates are completely wrong on this. That's December 13th. So December 13th. The only thing that are variable is I have to double check when my I think I mislabeled where my study leave happens to be. So that's the only thing. So now let's dive into this. So when now here comes Richard. So hi, Richard. Oh, I'm just waiting he's making sure he's all connected to, there he is. Hi, Richard. So all right. So with what you know about Revelation right now, I'm not talking after the course, what if you could sum up the book in one word or phrase, what would it be? Now you can do this out loud, or you can type it into the chat. Yeah, Ron.
Curiosity.
Curiosity. Okay, I'm going to put some of these into the chat. So curiosity. Okay.
Not necessarily one word, but the end of the world being forecast.
Yeah. All right. End of the world. Apocalyptic. Okay. What else?
Mystical.
Mystical. Okay.
I think I would also say confusing.
Mm-hmm. That's probably that's entirely fair. Okay. Confusing. Any others? I mean, you can always add stuff to the chat as we go through. Now, I'm going to use two different words here: influential and enigmatic. My word choice is intentional, and I'll get into why that is in a second. You know, why am I using these some $25 words maybe? But one of the things is that it is influential in terms of popular culture. Let's be honest. Okay, so you know, for example, in evangelical Christian circles, I don't know if you've ever encountered these particular books before. They were popular during the late '90s and into the early 2000s, called the Left Behind series, and more in the evangelical Christian kind of circles. But the thing is, there's actually a tradition of that goes back even further. I'll be getting into that in a second. The other thing is mainstream popular culture. Iron Maiden, you know, and that, but also horror movies, you know, and the common denominator in all of these is that Revelation is associated with horror type themes. Even the Left Behind, like the Left Behind series, is functionally it's a horror movie. It's Christian horror is what it is. Now recently, there's also been a new one that's been added to the list here. I don't know if any of you have seen Good Omens, but it's parody of this, but it still has its roots in this kind of sort of this understanding of Revelation. Now, if I'm going to recommend any of these, you know, the Iron Maiden stuff really is actually a tribute to 70s schlocky horror. That's how they that was sort of intended with that. And of course, and you had the original version of the Omen and these horror films that were in that. And Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman did this with Good Omens. But anyway, let's just kind of toss them away and look at this. But on the other hand, inside churches, how many of you have seen images like this in stained glass? Okay. So you have the Lamb here. You have these symbols, the Alpha and the Omega, and then you have Jesus standing at the door now, without, you know, the famous door without any handles. You know, behold, I stand at the door and knock. These are all images from Revelation that are pretty common in stained glass. Any church that I've been in stained glass, somewhere in the stained glass that they have, you can see these three images for sure. And they're all directly from Revelation. Now, Ron's going to like the next little bit that I've got. Is, did you know that 20 to 25% of Voices United draws a direct inspiration from the book of Revelation? 20 to 25%. And so, which is kind of interesting, because like I'm going to bring this up in a little bit going ahead. But so many of the hymns that we sing draw their influence with it. And for example, with this coming Sunday being, it's Reformation Sunday, and it's with it being kind of Reformation Sunday and sort of sliding into All Saints. Most, not all, in this particular case, not all, but most of the hymns for this Sunday draw their inspiration from Revelation. Trouble is we don't often realize that. Now, the reason that I picked the word enigmatic is that it's difficult to understand. Even the word enigmatic is difficult to understand. This goes to Ron's point of confusing. The confusing, the mystical, that kind of enigmatic element to it. And here's another little point. And some of you, if you took the evolution of the Bible, is that Revelation was part of a group of books that were not universally accepted. They were part of a group of books called anti-logomenia, which meant that they were spoken against, that they weren't part of, like, for example, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, most of the letters attributed to Paul. These were all considered to be core canonical around the time that the church was trying to figure out what they would consider as their sacred text. And particularly, the Hebrew scriptures they had more or less figured out, but in terms of Christian scriptures, there were these groups, and Revelation was one of the ones that ultimately it ended up in the Bible, but it was but it was one of the ones where it was not universally used or recognized. By contrast, there's another book called The Shepherd of Hermas, which actually also has elements of apocalyptic literature as part of it as well, that didn't make the consensus. And it's still around. You can go and read it. It's not a secret, but it wasn't elevated to the level of sacred scripture, whereas Revelation was. And so it was only until about the 5th century where that actually began to happen, that between the 2nd century and the 5th century where these conversations were happening, Revelation was starting to be used more widely. This goes back to some of my Presbyterian roots, but it may interest you that John Calvin, the great Reformed theologian and idol, I guess, of Presbyterians, is that he wrote a commentary on every book of the Bible except for Revelation. Martin Luther, on the other hand, would prefer to have not had it in, along with James, he preferred to have just simply removed from the Bible altogether. But tradition overrode that. And there was another point that I was going to bring up. I'm hoping that it'll come back to my head at some point. That's sort of that's related to this. But it was written in a language and a literary form that scholars refer to as apocalyptic literature. But the only thing is apocalyptic literature assumes that you already know what the author's talking about. Okay, it assumes that you already know what the symbols are, and that's the trouble. Is when we read Revelation, many years later, and I now remember what my point was, is that that it presupposes that people already know what those symbols are. And here we are, roughly 1900 years, a little more than 1900 years after its writing, where we don't have that cultural context which a Revelation was written for. We don't have that anymore. So I'm going to get into that in just a little bit. But the other thing is that interesting little fun fact is that Revelation has been used to predict the end of the world for about the past 1700 years, usually reaching a fever pitch every 100 years. Okay. And just a rhetorical question, how many times has that interpretive tradition been right? You're still here, aren't you? Okay. That's the point that I'm trying to make. It has been used to predict the end of the world consistently for a very long time, and that has been consistently wrong. So that should give you a clue as to maybe that's not how Revelation is supposed to be understood. And so like usually it's kind of like, okay, they got it wrong, but we've got it right now. I'm going to get into that a little bit now. Now, here's the problem: is because of that, because it's difficult to understand, especially in mainline denominations, we've just kind of let the fundies have it. And that's why this course is called Reclaiming Revelation. It's kind of like, no, this is it is part of the Bible. It is worthwhile. It is but right now we've just kind of, it's just too weird. Okay, so we're not going to touch it, and it's amplified by the cycle of readings that we have. Like generally, I have this calendar here that is it has lectionary readings all down one side of tells me what the prescribed scripture readings are for any given Sunday. It's a cycle that happens over about 3 years, and it's something that the church developed over time. But curiously enough, in this cycle, in this lectionary, it only appears 10 times in that 3-year cycle. So 10 on 10 Sundays out of 52 times 3, so 156 Sundays, it appears only 10 times. And even then, of the readings that show up, it only represents about 118 verses. And so that represents about maybe a little over 1.5% of the suggested readings during our 3-year cycle. So we have very little exposure to Revelation from the lectionary cycle. We just don't hear it. But of course, by contrast, that it represents a fifth to a quarter of all of the hymns that we have in our hymn books. So we don't like to read it, but we like to sing it. And like for example, just off the top of my head is, like, for example, crown him with many crowns. Guide me, O the great Jehovah, is mostly out of Exodus, but that last verse, there's this line, death of death and hell's destruction, which I'm going to come back to a little later. That's Revelation. So there's these verses that come to mind that we don't like to read it, but we like to sing it, which actually gives us a little bit of clue about the power of the book. But the problem is, because we've largely stepped back from it, there's been a vacuum. As I mentioned before, since its original writing, almost every generation has used Revelation to predict the last days of the world within their own lifetime. And how many of them have been right? By the way, just added to that, how many of you missed the memo about the rapture happening on September 25th? I didn't get the memo.
No.
Okay. It happened to be at I think the 25th was, I believe it was a Sunday. It's like, I don't know. I didn't get the memo. I didn't even know it was happening. And we're still here. But curiously enough, on a more serious note, there was an article that appeared. I'm trying to remember what paper, just a couple weeks ago, amongst people who raised in evangelical traditions where this kind of thought is like, this sort of thing is very prevalent, and it's actually creating spiritual trauma. And there would be cruel jokes that people would play on each other, just leaving the, like everybody would leave their house except for one of the kids, and they'd leave all their clothes around. Spiritual abuse is what that is. So here's a question: is if it's so weird, and if like why do we want to reclaim it? And one of the things is, obvious things. It's part of the Bible. It genuinely is part of our sacred scriptures. And while Martin Luther probably may have had some points in terms of saying we don't want this, it is still part of, and has been part of it for almost 2,000 years. And not only that, it is if you kind of get past the weirdness of it, it is a powerful pastoral letter to the early church and to the church in any time. So there's some important things in it. It's also about providing wisdom in the middle of a real historical crisis, and we're going to get to that when we get into the history a little bit later. And because of its style, it is a unique witness to how to something about the early church fairly early on. But what I want to do now is put it this way: we misunderstand so much of Revelation that I almost have to start at the beginning with the basics of exploding some very common misconceptions as to what Revelation is. But we need to also say, we almost have to start off by saying what it's not, before, just to kind of set the frame so that we're not kind of getting off track. So a couple things. It is called Revelation, not Revelations, plural. Okay, this is one of my hangups, and any of my clergy friends who are sort of are aware of this. It is one revelation. It is not it's not like the esoteric sayings of Nostradamus, who have these lines after lines after lines. It is one revelation. It is all pointing in the same direction. So it's called Revelation, not Revelations. And I've actually had some colleagues who make this mistake. So don't feel bad if you've made this mistake, but I will catch you. I will call you on it. The other thing is, Revelation, despite what it looks like, is not written in code. Okay, most of us think, oh, it's written in code. I'll get into why it's not code. It's also not to be read as future history. It was never written to be understood as writing it for some far off time. It was written to its current time. And this last one is probably the one that is going to make your hair stand up, because most of you probably been raised is that, in fact, Revelation is exactly that. It is not future history. And the trouble is that, particularly because of that last fact, we're going to have to do some real work to reclaim it. And so part of that is I want to get into the very first thing that I want to do is I want to take whether you are aware of it or not, chances are you have been exposed to a particular way of interpreting Revelation. And the very first thing that I need to do is I need to actually take that apart. And it is the interpretive method is called dispensationalism. And the thing is, if you've been exposed to Revelation at all, and I'm going to get into this in a little more deeply, is that much of the popular understanding of Revelation, both in pop culture, things like The Omen and things like that, or in the Left Behind series, or before that, the late great Planet Earth, from Hal Lindsey, those kinds of things is a reflection of a particular theological movement or method of understanding called dispensationalism. And it's not as it's actually nowhere close to being as old as you think it is. And so partly it developed in the 1820s and I'll get into the personalities in a second, but it developed in the 1820s in England and Ireland originally, in the middle of the there were like when the Reformation happened and started in 1517, there were actually a whole series of religious movements that kind of ebbed and flowed in the aftermath of the Reformation. And you had a lot of groups, like this was a period where that if people didn't like what was happening, they'd split off and form their own church. And it just kind of like, there's a reason that there's 33,000 different Christian denominations in North America today. That kind of whole splintering and fragmenting. And this formation of denominations, and one of the early ones was a group called the Plymouth Brethren, and that formed in the English city of Plymouth. They were called the Plymouth Brethren because they were known to call each other brother. Not terribly inclusive, but I'm not exactly sure what their term for. They may have used sisters, but they as well, but they were using. But that would sound awfully Catholic, because this group was definitely not. They were not fans of the Roman Catholic Church at all. And so the Plymouth Brethren, and the thing is, while they formed in England, they actually one of the founders of the movement was a guy by the name of John Nelson Darby, and many of them, because of they had these peculiar beliefs, and they wanted to exercise their religious freedom in as they developed some of their a little off really what were off the wall kind of beliefs, but they had the freedom to do that in the United States, in North America, and particularly they settled in and around the area around Niagara Falls. So when they moved to the United States, I'm not saying sort of generically, like they actually like you can actually locate a lot of the movement to the lower Great Lakes, and specifically on the U.S. side, but bleeding over into the Niagara Peninsula for this. And so suddenly this goes from sort of something distant historical to ground this is an area that I've personally lived in at one point. And I was actually first exposed to dispensationalism, curiously enough, at a Presbyterian church in Niagara Falls when I was in grade 4. So the idea is that what Darby developed was the idea is that he provided a framework in understanding the Bible as a whole, but it allowed for understanding of Revelation as a whole. And he developed a method of interpretation. The scholars tend to use, or scholars and ministers tend to use, when we're talking amongst ourselves, we'll tend to use jargon. And the term is hermeneutics, which means basically a method of interpretation, or a means of interpretation, or a way of interpreting. So he developed one in which he saw history divided up into dispensational periods. And the idea is that these dispensations were different ways that humanity interacted, that God interacted with humanity. And so, he came up with these different ways, and most of them are very much locked in the Bible. For example, the period of innocence is more or less finishes by chapter 3 of Genesis. And then you have the period of innocence, you have the period of conscience. Now, some of this I don't fully understand. But from Adam to Noah, so, okay, well, we've got to like chapter 5, chapter 6 of Genesis here, and he's already through 2 historical dispensations from his point of view. Then you have Noah to Abraham. Well, we're still in Genesis here, of government. In this case, well, it's kind of like, okay, well, that's normally covenant. So I'm not sure, like, I don't fully get this, but I'm just relaying to you what it was. And then the patriarchy is Abraham to Moses, or patriarchal rule. And then you have the Mosaic, the law, and then of course you have the law, the prophets, and everything else, and Moses to Christ. So this basically, the first 5 dispensations cover the Hebrew scripture, or what we call the Old Testament period. But by the way, I forgot my ground rule. There's no such thing as a stupid question, and there's never a bad time to ask it. So if you have a question, probably the best bet is, everybody know how to put up their hand in Zoom? Okay. And then that's probably the best way. But I mean, if you kind of wave that you've got your camera active, I should be able to see that. So anyway, continuing on, dispensation number 6 is the age of grace, which is, according to Darby, the current church age. From Christ until present. And then Darby envisioned that the millennial kingdom, the what's coming next, is that that historical dispensation. And a lot of the heat that dispensationalism generates usually is focused around this 7th one of what's coming next. Now, the other thing is that there's 4 tenets for dispensationalism. Is there's a distinction between Israel and the church. Exactly how that is, I couldn't tell you. There's a distinction between law and grace. And not only that, from their point of the Plymouth Brethren's point of view, is that the New Testament church was not a part of God's plan. It was more of an accident that happened, but and the other thing, and this is where it's most influential, is the belief in a secret rapture, that God will come and snatch away the true believers before the second coming of Christ. And this is probably the big one that that many of you may have heard of. I don't know if any of you received this morning in the mail.
No.
So Ron, you got one? Okay. I know Richard got one. It says, this big flyer. You know what? I need to change my camera. So I'm going to turn off my background so you can see me here at the office, because unfortunately when I hold stuff up, it doesn't. So anyway, it says, what's next? This literally arrived in the mail this morning. And it's a seminar being held at the and Richard was asking, like, do we coordinate with other churches with this? And our future has arrived. It's this big glossy thing. And don't miss this opportunity of a lifetime. It's being held at Seventh-day Adventist Church on Highway 19 this Saturday. Curiously enough, the Seventh-day Adventist Church emerged out of one of these, every 100, one of these setting a date for the second coming of Christ. In this case, it was what were called the Millerites. In the middle of the 19th century, had said, Jesus is coming back on this date. People quit their jobs, sold their property, and all assembled in one place, only for it not to happen. And it was called the Great Disappointment. And out of that, the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Seventh-day Adventist and a few others emerged, still holding on to this theology. but those evolved into these denominations today. Richard actually got my, there's language that I would use to describe this that I think you might lodge a complaint if I did. To soften it up just a little bit, using a quote from Mashed Bullpup. And I'm going to get into a little bit more reason why. But unfortunately, it comes from a point of view of scaring people into faith is not faith at all. Ron, you had a question.
Just a comment, John. If you don't want to say it, just put it in the chat.
I could, but then there's a recording of the yeah. Anyway, so but you understand. Richard actually heard me use it this morning.
Thanks, Ron. I appreciate that.
So, but anyway, well, here's a couple characteristics of dispensationalism. Like, and really, these are tools to recognize it, because it's important. It's like this is probably the most influential way of interpreting Revelation because nobody else has done it. Like, there's this huge vacuum in terms of trying to understand Revelation, and so instead, this is what's occupied the vacuum. It's a very literalist understanding of the Bible. There is no room for metaphor at all. And because of this dispensation notion, the concept, like historical concept, is irrelevant. Okay, it basically it clamps blinders onto you, not to look. Like it says, you don't want to be reading history. You don't want to be reading this. Because it means what we tell you it means now, as opposed to understanding its historical context. And so the history is actually downplayed or made irrelevant. It's also, because of its background, is very suspicious of any cooperation across denominational lines. Very, very suspicious of ecumenism. Like our cooperation with Trinity Catholic, for example, would be highly suspect. The reality that, we probably would not have been able to buy this building directly from the Jehovah's Witnesses, rather than the roundabout way that this building came to us. Probably that would be part of it as well. But at the same time, the question is, okay, well, if it was so kind of off the wall, how did it become so influential? Well, that goes back to the early 20th century by a guy by the name of Cyrus Scofield. Cyrus Scofield was very much a student within the Plymouth Brethren tradition. He very much was bought into the dispensationalist theology, and so in that he published his own a copy of the Bible. I believe it was a King James. Was like, oh yeah, the other thing is they also tend to stick to the King James version, but they worked with the King James translation, but he did a commentary, and so he would annotate things, and in the annotations it reflected, it was called the Scofield Reference Bible in 1909. There are people like the church that I served in Mississauga. There was someone in the congregation who had one and referred to it frequently. And those references reflect dispensationalist theology. It was very popular because, it was published in 1909. Now, keep in mind what happened not too long after 1909. And it was popular, but a part of what made it more and more popular is that it was published right on the eve of the First World War. And of course, in the First World War, you had war immediately followed by the Spanish flu pandemic. So you had war, pestilence, and then not too long, following that, after the Roaring '20s, you also had the famine in the in the Great Depression, and of course, death all across that. So, these four horsemen of the apocalypse, compared to today, it was much worse then. And during those uncertain times, it kind of occupied this vacuum that nobody else was talking to. And so it was very popular. 2 million copies published by the end of the Second World War. And so, of course, when the Second World War ended, you went straight into the Cold War and all additional anxieties in there. But by this point, Schofield's stuff had largely transitioned into almost exclusively the fundamentalist sphere, but it had a mass market appeal. And so then from that Schofield reference Bible, then you had these pop culture things that emerged off this. You had in print The Late Great Planet Earth from Hal Lindsey in 1970, but it wasn't just that book. There was a number of them. I remember commercials like on mainstream TV for The Late Great Planet Earth. I don't know if any of you have heard of it, or even or if you have, if you've read it. And then, of course, there was the Left Behind series from Tim LaHaye and Sherry Jenkins that continued on that. And then mass media television. These are just a couple. These were more popular in the late 90s, but there was one that was actually called This Week in Bible Prophecy. And then there's Jack Van Impe Presents, which, curiously enough, Jack Van Impe died, I think, 5 years ago, and it's still on. And the 30 years ago, I did my internship in 1994. So yeah, 28 years ago, he said Jesus is coming back within 7 years. So, and then of course you also have the churches, the pop culture that we were talking about. Now, here's the troubles with dispensationalism, and this is why, functionally, what I've been trying to do is load this into a canon, and I'm about to shoot it out the window. But here's some of the problems. History is irrelevant, and to someone like me who is a historian, that's horrifying. Because if history is made irrelevant, then the text means whatever you want it to mean. Not only that, that printed word is completely removed from the historical situation. Then it makes facts to fit. Like, for example, the word rapture never appears anywhere in the Bible. It is a completely non-biblical idea. Now, some will point out that there's passages in Matthew, and specifically also in Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians, that's describing the rapture of this kind of meeting in the air, or one person being left and one taken. But that's a very that's kind of cherry picking what you want out of it, and so it's a very much non-biblical idea. It's also very, very, very subjective. Even though you say, well, I'm just reading what the Bible says, you're going in with your own biases without any filters on, and you're actually reading it to fit your own views. I should say, unfortunately, Christian nationalism that you may have been hearing about in the news is heavily influenced. I'm almost losing my voice here. Christian nationalism is heavily influenced by this particular understanding. And it's this works righteousness form of interpretation. And the idea is that it motivates people by fear, not by faith. Here, get your ticket and just sit and wait for the train to come. And so there's no incentive for it to actually help or get involved with God's creation. So, and the other thing is that it's treating the Bible like a crystal ball. And if you really look carefully at the way that they use it, they're using it the same way that a medium might use like a crystal ball or that sort of thing. And yet the difference is, someone particularly when they're working with, I don't know, tarot cards and things like that they understand it to be more entertainment than anything else. Whereas here, they're serious. But if I'm like I use the word bullpucky, but the other word that is appropriate is heresy. That this completely goes off the rails in terms of understanding. And yet probably most people, when they think of Revelation, have been influenced by this understanding. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this is I'm going to say, okay, this is what dispensationalism is. You've probably been exposed to it, but we are going to take that entire understanding and we're going to set it aside, load it into cannon, fire it out the window. Now, if you want at the end of this think that I'm full of it, want to go back and grab it, fine. That's but what I want to try and do is we're just going to set all that aside, and periodically during this study we might have to realize, okay, that's a dispensationalist filter that we need to set aside. So I wanted to put this out all in front right away. So now we actually get into the fun stuff. So realizing, Ron, you have to leave in 6 minutes, so I'm going to try and cover some of this. But the recording, I'll get this up as soon as possible so that Ron, you can catch the remainder of it. So
Well, thank you, John. And I'm really sorry to have to leave, but this was set up for a long time. So
I understand. So
see you tomorrow.
see you tomorrow.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, Ron. Okay. So often it's a good when working with the when doing biblical studies and things like that, particularly if you're approaching it more from a scholarly perspective, is to get into the who, where, when, what, and why. The basic W5 and also how as well. We'll kind of get into that. But what I wanted to do is, curiously enough, one of the easier questions to ask about Revelation is, who wrote it? One of the things that we do know is Revelation was written by one person. It's a cohesive whole. Unlike unlike say some of the Old Testament books where it came together in different from different time periods and different people, or Isaiah that has at least 2, possibly 3 different authors, and that kind of thing, or and it's a cohesive whole. Now, we scholars believe that Revelation evolved, but it was still the same person involved from word 1 to from the opening verse to the last verse. So it is a cohesive whole. Individually, it identifies the person that identifies themselves by name as John. Now, early traditions said, well, John the Apostle, or the writer of the Gospel of John, and the letters of John, and but the thing is, if you really look at the language of Revelation and compare it to John, it's very, very different. So more often than not, sometimes we refer to this individual as John of Patmos, John the Revelator, or even if you're in Victoria, there's even a church called St. John the Divine, and that's this the author of Revelation. But the thing is, aside from this name, we don't know who that person is. And the thing is, just a little fun fact, John is the most common name in the world. By the way, hi, John. Because we have in fact we have 3 people here whose name is John. Not just John Helps or myself, but Jean is the feminine version of John. So the trouble is, just saying John wrote it is kind of like saying Bob Smith wrote it in some respects, because it's an extremely common name. But we still work with it. Someone by the name of John wrote Revelation, but we can know things about. So even though we don't know specifically the individual who wrote it, we know several things about them. And here's some, and this is actually the really interesting stuff. We do know, for various reasons, that the John of Revelation had to have been very fluent in Greek, because he wrote in advanced poetic forms inside Revelation itself, and it's one of these things where, of course, when we're reading it in translation, we don't get a sense of the poetry of the book, but it's written in quite advanced poetic forms. Also, extremely literate, very well read, familiar with, and must have had access to the Old Testament, as well as other literature. Very well read, very, very literate individual. Also a mathematician, was schooled in Greek mathematics. And part of that is because numerology is a factor in this book. And we're going to get into that next week, when we get into that in a little bit more detail. So someone who was extraordinarily well educated, which, if you consider like kind of on the cusp, probably by the time that that Revelation was written, and we're going to get into that in a second, is that probably, you know, someone of like a very scholarly level, kind of understanding. So the next question is, well, who was Revelation written for? And specifically, it's the early church in Asia Minor. When we get into the letters to the seven churches, I'm going to bring up a Google Earth fly around, so you get to see that. But to the early church in Asia Minor, and if you're not sure where Asia Minor is, it's modern day Turkey. So sometimes referred to as Anatolia. It's had various names over time. Today we know it's Turkey, but it's basically Turkey along the Aegean coast, and then down one of the valleys partway in. But several of the cities are right along the coast, including Ephesus, as part of that. It was during a time, like it was written for the early church or early Christians in Asia Minor, during a time where there was either threatened or perceived persecution from Roman authorities, but also the concern of being culturally overwhelmed. There's one of the teachers at VST, Harry Meyer, argues, and he also specializes in apocalyptic literature and Revelation, makes a very good argument that the concern of cultural assimilation is a major theme in Revelation, and we're going to get into that. So there's my other point there. But also, this, curiously enough, we actually know where at least part of Revelation was written, and that was on the island of Patmos. And I don't know if I actually have a map here, but I may be able to bring this up. And I just have to, unfortunately, this is, I have to sort of shrink my window back here. I may be able to bring this up. Is I have to shrink my window down, and now Patmos is a real place. In fact, have any of you been there? Because even though it's off the coast of Turkey, I'm going to stop the share, and I'm going to bring up my little Google Maps window here. All right, so I just need to share the screen again. Share. And here we are. So welcome to the island of Patmos. And so that really doesn't tell you too much. Okay, it looks like an island. Let's zoom out a little bit. Okay. Patmos is part of Greece, even though it is off the coast of Turkey, but you have Patmos here, and then Izmir is actually where Ephesus is. And so most, if we zoom way out here, most of the churches the Revelation is written to is in this area here. Like not even as far as north as what was at the time called Byzantium. The Patmos is right here, and typical of these Greek islands. Let's just do a little bit of a satellite change here. Very mountainous. And this is where Revelation was understood to, traditionally understood to have been written, but because like that's where, John indicates that yes, he wrote it, at least part of it, on Patmos. So I need to bring up the chat window again. Here we are. Okay, so probably John was likely a resident of Asia Minor. He knows the geography. What's clear from as we get into this a little bit more, that John knew the geography of Asia Minor quite well. So unlike, say, for example, in the Gospel of Mark, where Mark doesn't seem to know the areas in and around Jerusalem very well, it's very clear that John knows his way around Asia Minor because of how he presents it. So when was it written? Well, here's the thing. We actually know it had to have been written before 100. Because Revelation started being quoted in texts that we know are dated to 100. So it had to have been at some point before 100. It also had to have been written after 80, after the letters of Paul had moved into wider circulation. So we have this 20-year range. Now we can actually narrow that down even further. That we can actually put it into probably a 5-year time period between 90 and 95, and that was during a time of persecution and cultural assimilation. It's more a period of cultural assimilation under Emperor Domitian, who reigned between 81 and 96. But here's the thing. It had to have been before 90, Domitian died in 96. So there's the death of an emperor, especially given the content of Revelation, would had to have mentioned the death of an emperor in it. And since it doesn't, that's why it's kind of cuts off a year before Domitian's death. So that's that narrower time range. Now, the more interesting question is, what is Revelation? And Revelation, I've used this before, mentioned this before, is a form of writing known as apocalyptic literature. Now, here's the thing. When I use the word apocalyptic, what do you think?
Future.
Okay, future.
Disaster.
Like we use terms like apocalyptic terms, like for example, in the aftermath of the Gulf War, in the early 1990s, as Iraqi forces retreated, they blew a lot of wells, and there was just like fire and smoke, and the terms that people used was apocalyptic to describe that scene of the sky blacked out under black smoke and fires and things like that. That's what they use. Here's the interesting thing. The word apocalypse, and so when I use the word apocalypse, what do you think? Same sort of thing? If there exists an example of a word that is completely transformed from its original intent, the word apocalypse is almost by itself at the top of the list of something that means in English now something that it never meant or even was close to meaning that in Greek. And so when we use the term apocalyptic literature, we're actually using it more in the Greek term. And apocalypse in Greek means to reveal, to unveil, to pull back the curtain. Okay, that's what apocalypse means. It means apocalyptic literature. And so this style of literature existed from about roughly 200 BC to about 100 AD. Some of the earliest forms of it were around 500. There's examples of it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example. Something called the War Scroll is apocalyptic literature. In Christian literature that didn't make it into that didn't make the cut, so to speak, the Shepherd of Hermas represents that. There were lots and lots and lots of different forms of apocalyptic literature. Daniel, parts of the book of Daniel, on which Revelation does actually rely, is also considered to be an early form of apocalyptic literature. But Revelation itself is the only start to finish apocalyptic work in the entire Bible. Like, for example, not too long ago, there was a passage I referenced from Mark chapter 13 that's sometimes referred to as the little apocalypse. But Revelation is the only one that is from start to finish a complete apocalyptic work. But there are hundreds of examples there. Like, there's a couple of websites there's two websites you can check out called Early Jewish Writings and Early Christian Writings that actually include not just the biblical books, but also all the other ones that supposedly are locked in some Vatican vault someplace. The reality is it's all out there. We've known about it for a while. It's just because it's not something that is in the Bible that we read, we're not as aware of it. But there's hundreds of examples. But the literature, the apocalyptic literature as a literary form, as a form of writing, more or less fell out of favor probably in the throughout the second and third century in terms of people writing new versions of it. So what we have is basically an artifact of a literary style that no longer exists, at least in conventional terms. There is one major exception in pop culture a couple of years ago. If any of you ever saw a movie called Ready Player One, it's actually a really good example of how apocalyptic literature works. The trouble is, if I tell you to go see it, unless you grew up in the 1980s, you're not going to get it. And I'll explain why in a second. Because apocalyptic literature is very symbolic in the language that it uses. It uses symbolic language in form, but also in the way it conveys its information. It uses these very cosmic scale. When I say dualistic in tone, that means the struggle between good and evil. Very, very much at a cosmic scale. It also uses visual language and symbolic language to send a particular message to people, and it also integrates numbers and all kinds of different things. But it's not code. The difference between code, a symbolic language, and coded language is a coded language means that you have to have a cipher that that this corresponds to this corresponds to this. Whereas symbolic language, just simply, it's intended to evoke an emotional response to people who already understand and know the context. So I'm going to put a little saying up on the screen, and some of you may already be familiar with this in a moment. But the Greek word, as I mentioned before, apokalypsos, means to uncover or reveal. And so revelation in Greek, if you actually look at it in Greek, the word is called apokalypsos. So it's the Apocalypse of John, sort of transliterated, but it means revelation. Apocalypse means to reveal or revelation. So apocalyptic literature is writing that reveals, ironically, by doing it through symbolic language. We have a number of modern day analogies for that, but anyway, the other biblical examples are passages from Ezekiel and Daniel, Mark 13, 1 Thessalonians, beyond the Bible itself, but still within Christian scripture. In Jewish traditions, you have the Apocalypse of Baruch, and you have the War Scroll. Again, I mentioned these already. The Apocalypse of Peter and the Shepherd of Hermas are also ones. These ones are available on the internet. You can go read any of these if you want. So part of it is the language and the symbols are already known to the target audience. So here's my modern example. The senators and the sailors battled it out for the Holy Grail. What am I talking about?
Hockey.
Okay,
How did you know?
we've done this before.
Of course, well, of course, for those of you who again, this is the one thing that I pulled into that last session. But yes, it is hockey, because here you have that cultural context that if you generally, most of the time, if you're Canadian, not always, but if you're Canadian, the hockey culture is out there, and so you're aware of teams that have the name Senators and Sabres, and the Holy Grail is the Stanley Cup, because it kind of looks like it's this enormous silver cup. So it is, for us, it's hockey language. But the thing is, to somebody who completely outside of this context might understand this as politicians and the military fighting over religious authority. Now, there's an argument to be made that the Stanley Cup, at least in Canada, is a religious authority in and of itself. But be that as it may, what we have here is we do use this kind of language even now. Political cartoons are also really good examples. Like, for example, if I bring up certain animals, like if you have a bear, an eagle, and a beaver, what am I talking about here? Oh, and a tiger. Let's put a tiger on the end of that. Okay. We associate.
Yeah, associate that with Canada, represents our birds, the animals, and
Well, that's one possibility. But if each one represented a certain nation, what would each of them represent? Like the beaver, you got right. The beaver represents Canada.
yeah.
Eagle is the US, and bear is Russia, and the tiger, I'm just trying to play India, I think.
Yes, and so if you put a panda there, that would be China. So there are certain animals that become with that. Or, for example, any political cartoon from the States these days, if you have a donkey and an elephant, they have a subtext of Democrats and Republicans, for example. So there's all those kinds of things. We do use this language. We're just not aware that we use it. But of course, when it's outside of our current sphere, we don't really get it. And so part of that language is others there. So the other thing is we also tend to use in our own politics. We also use kind of code languages, and this is intended to be politically agnostic, of showing you the negative terms used in apocalyptic terms to describe three of our political parties.
Yeah.
Okay. It should be obvious as to, now please, this is not betraying my political biases. Some of these are I find insulting myself. So regardless of what your political stripe is, they are intended to what they do is they're conflating images together to convey a particular meaning or convey something, good or bad. There can be positive apocalyptic images and negative ones. The symbols and the numbers we're going to get to next. We're going to get to next week. I know that I dipped a little bit into the numerology when I did that when I did the overview, but we get to that in more depth. So the whole point is, well, if it's so weird and it's written in a symbolic language, well, why was it written in the first place? The idea is hope amidst darkness. At a time where the early Christian church was persecution was a real thing. It did happen, but there was also truthfully what the greater threat was irrelevance, because even by the time that Revelation was written, and I'm going to get to this as well, there might have been 6,000 Christians across the entire Roman Empire. And so from a census perspective, I think I've used the stats perspective, that there weren't enough Christians on there that if you were doing a census and putting down your religious tradition, the Christians would broadly fall under the other box in terms of faith tradition. They weren't even a blip on people's radar. In fact, I think I remember actually quoting something that in 2001, 20,000 people in Canada self-identified as Jedi. There were more, so in 2001, there were a higher percentage of people that identified as their religious tradition as as Jedi from Star Wars. Then were Christians in the Roman Empire by proportion. So irrelevance was another thing. The other thing is also it's a pretty strong anti-governmental screed, or anti-imperial screed, which would be a better way to put it. And you will see that when we get to, especially when we get to session 5, there's a complete takedown of the Roman Empire that's beautiful. But it also reminds early Christians of who's actually in control. So it has this theological underpinning that, in spite of all of its lurid imagery, that God is still in charge. So that's where that is. Before we get into preparing for next week, and I'm going to apologize for what I've written here because this is all optional. Please do take it as this way. Before I put that stuff up on the screen, do we have any questions? So anyway, I know I'm probably not going to go to this. And well, actually, yeah, like there are, and it's saying,
Well, John,
yeah,
some part of me wants to go just to see how many people show up.
yeah. The only trouble is they'll take your name, and you will start getting this.
I wouldn't go in. I would just be on the outside watching the amount of vehicles and people that showed up to go, okay, I now know I'm not in the right place in Canada because I do need to move somewhere else.
Well, the thing is, like, oh, John, go ahead.
I'll go with you if you're looking for somebody to go with. I already, they've already got me on their mailing list somehow.
Well, this was a general flyer drop. I mean, we got it here at the church. That's where this flyer came from. So I think they were doing just a general mail drop. But anyway, what I'm kind of hoping is this provides a counterpoint, and like this was not planned. Figured out, okay, we're going to do Revelation, but I had no idea that the Seventh-day Adventists were doing this. So and the thing is, it's important not to make fun of that, because people who earnestly want to learn the Bible, but unfortunately, there's also a group of people who are willing to, let's just say that the church has been a hotbed of deceptive individuals for a very long time. And in fact, we know that because there's actually references to these deceptive individuals throughout the New Testament as well. And so we do have to be very, very cautious about that, is that, and particularly with the dispensationalist understanding, it's very pervasive. And because it has occupied the vacuum of not have of nobody else is actually offering something like this, of saying, you know what, maybe all those predictions of saying the world's going to end here, and here are wrong. And then these same groups will say, oh, well, no, like only God knows the time and place, but you need to get ready, because that's often a counterpoint. And then that slowly builds to them wanting to set a date. And some of the ones on the fringes will start setting dates, and those inevitably are wrong. And others will kind of pull back with there's this kind of, this movement back and forth. But it unfortunately, it capitalizes on fear, is what I find it does. So here's a couple of things. When we get into Revelation, and these points will be brought up, is when I first developed this, I actually created assignments, and these assignments, please understand, these are optional. You do not have to do what I'm suggesting here, but these are things that you can do, okay? And they may be, so for example, what are you expecting from Revelation? Like, what are some things that you would like to know? That I would find useful, and those you can email directly to. Like, are there any particular things that you want to learn about? Anything that you wanting to kind of me to spend a little bit more time on? I mean, yes, I have this study largely done, but there's always room to kind of move into that and adjust things moving forward. And what are you hoping to get out of that? And so some of this can be, for yourself, but if there's some things specifically in terms of questions or things that you really want to get into, email that to me. Assignment number 2 is try. I'm not saying do it. I'm saying just try to read Revelation in a single sitting. Just sit down and read it. Note where you find symbols and numbers, but please do not try and just wrestle, try and figure out what those symbols mean. Okay, just note what the symbols are, but don't does that mean helicopters? It's kind of like, no, it does not mean helicopters. And the reason I bring that one up in particular is Jack Van Itten was going, see, helicopters in the Bible. And I'm not kidding. It was one of the, oddly enough, I think it was an episode where he was doing that, because just a little bit of a background, because we're at the tail end of tonight, is there were a couple of reasons why I decided to delve into apocalyptic literature and to get a sense of what it means, particularly from a mainline church perspective, and to get into the scholarship of it, is that when I was doing my internship down in Victoria, I would usually stay in Saturday nights, not go anywhere, because I had Sunday mornings to deal with. And Jack Van Impe Presents was playing on the Vision Network alongside This Week in Bible Prophecy every Saturday night. And as I was flipping channels, I would come across it. Longest I ever lasted was 5 minutes. And the thing is, it just occurred to me from that point that I need to understand this better, because people in the congregations I'm going to are going to be asking questions. And sure enough, when I landed in Cornwall, the youth group that was there, that was their questions right off the bat. And it was clear that some of the more influential people in that youth group were heavily influenced by dispensationalism. And they wanted me, like, you know, I said, well, you know, like, do you want to do a Bible study? And the very first one, they all said, we want to do Revelation. And it's like, okay. And curiously enough, one of the earliest forms of this particular study emerged out of that youth group, responding to that need. But what I was offering was different from what they were being taught elsewhere. And unfortunately, I've also seen dispensationalism wreck people spiritually. It's spiritual, like at its core, it's spiritual abuse. So that's one of the reasons why I'm quite passionate about this one. So anyway, I realized it's kind of like, okay, try and sit and read Revelation in one sitting. Just note to yourself what some of the symbols and numbers are, but don't try and figure out what the symbols are, because they may not be inevitably you're gonna get tripped up over them. But do listen to what they evoke. On the other hand, don't figure out what the symbols are, but listen to what they evoke. Some of it's going to be weird, like when you get into the part where, you know, there's a river of blood like a meter deep, you know, for example. Yeah, that's going to be big. And that's stuff that's not in our lectionary. But do try and read through it. But also, as you're reading, particularly towards the beginning and towards the end, see if you can hear some of the songs that you sing in them. Is another one. It's just listen for the songs.
So how early in the day do I have to start if I'm going to read it in a single sitting?
I think honestly, I think you can read the whole thing in less than an hour. Because, well, actually, here, let me just bring up and do a word count here, because I did this once and I just don't have this at my fingertips. So hang on for a second. Because so Book of Revelation, and I think all told, Revelation itself is it's about 535 verses, and over 22 chapters. And so it isn't. This is not like sitting down and reading a novel. You can more or less finish this within an hour and a half. It might feel longer than that, depending on how much that you kind of get tangled in the weeds. But it doesn't take as long as you might think it might. I think here's another little bit of trivia that I'll come back to. Did you know that Revelation was intended to be read aloud in a service of worship? Whole thing, start to finish. It wasn't intended to be read in small chunks. It was it was meant to be read out loud and listened to. So there's my other little bit of trivia with it. So it shouldn't take you too long. I mean, it's certainly not like sitting down and reading the book of Jonah, which is like a 5-minute read. You know, it'll take you a little bit longer than that. But you know, I'd say probably an hour and a half. You know, and if you sit down to read a novel, novels certainly would. You'd sit down and read a novel for longer than that. And who knows, you might even blow through it even in half that time. You could go through it in 45 minutes, depending.
Or longer.
Sorry, I Marilyn, was that you?
No, I just said or longer. Yes.
Yeah.
I don't read fast.
Yeah. Well, and part of it is, but like I said, I mean, try. The word is try. And with all due respect to Yoda, there is try. There is not. It's not just simply do or do not. It's try. And the main thing is the operative word is to try to read it in a single setting. The King James version is difficult to read at the best of times. I would suggest New Revised Standard Version probably is a good one to work through. Common English version, if you have one or can have access to it. A good way to get access to whatever translation that you want is a place called BibleGateway.com. And they have every English translation. Well, I know almost every English translation out there. And those are some of the ones that, you can just sit down and like read it on the screen. And then just work with it. The main thing that I want you to pay attention to are note what different symbols are and numbers are back and forth. Like for example, some of the symbols are things like eyes or trumpets or bowls or lampstands, and of course the different numbers that are brought up, including that number, which we'll deal with. Which I did actually cover when it was my little teaser when I did the Revelation study of what that infamous number of the beast is. We're going to cover that next week, and then we'll deal with it again in session 5. So, all right. So we're just past 8:30. Any other questions?
Not a question.
Mm-hmm.
But I have one woman on my call list, and she always talks about the last days like being now, because she says, if you don't believe it, just look at the last book in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
And unfortunately, this past session would have probably met with a lot of friction in that particular case. I mean, I am offering this study. They are more than welcome to join. But that's one of the reasons why I did this particular session on dispensationalism, just because it is so pervasive, and in the presence of a vacuum with nothing else to fill it, they're gonna, and because it's it has a certain mass market appeal. Like there was a woman in the congregation that I served in Mississauga who was firmly a dispensationalist. She came to every session that I did, really enjoyed it, but kind of went back and with her dispensation, with that theology. But as I've said before, just my experience of the dispensationalist theology has been very much, it's spiritually abusive, is what it is. And it also gets in the way of us actually understanding what Revelation is about, and that's important, that there's actually there's an interpretive tradition out there that actually, ironically, puts a veil in front of Revelation, saying we know what it means and we're going to tell you what it means, rather than pulling the veil back, which is what Revelation is supposed to be doing. So, but yeah, I mean, this study is available for anybody who wants to come, even of that particular theological, and the thing is, as a pastoral letter moving forward, I think it's important to talk about. And I mean, for example, my recap next week, I do touch on that a little bit, just as a reminder, because there are, whether we know it or not, it is influencing us, even if we're not diehard dispensationalists. We're aware of movies like The Omen. or things like that. It's in the background. It will always be in the background. And the intent is to try and say, okay, knowing that it's there, let's try and set it aside so we're actually focusing on the book itself. And I hope you get I hope it's an enjoyable experience. Revelation is actually not supposed to be scary. It never was supposed to be scary. And I'm hoping to, ironically, just ahead of Halloween, to say this isn't the scary book we think it is.
And I read the 12 books on Left Behind.
Yeah.
I read every one of them. And I never, ever 1 minute thought of it as a horror story.
Interesting. Because curiously enough, the television and movie ones have often been portrayed of this, particularly of the experience of the rat is very much that that kind of experience. But I've encountered people who were reading those books that were terrified. But again, there was also, like I said, there was an article. Actually, I think it was actually on. If I can find the article, I can maybe share. I'll try and share it next week about evangelical Christians who, particularly in that dispensationalist thing, were traumatized growing up because they would have their friends or family or leave clothes behind and all scatter out of the house thinking that they've missed the rapture, or that living in constant fear that I'm not good enough to be taken away in the rapture, that I've been left behind. Because the overall message of the Left Behind series is you don't want to be left behind.
That's right.
So in that sense, the premise is one of existential, effectively existential horror. Strictly speaking, like we're not talking ghosts and goblins and things like that, but on a deeper existential level. I've been curiously enough, I've been kind of brushing up on something unrelated to this, on the concepts of what's called cosmic horror. And some of that can be almost understood in the sense, and what I'm trying to say is no, it's not. Revelation is not that at all. In fact, it's actually quite the opposite, and a hopeful book, even if the imagery is just a little weird. So, all right. With that, any other questions? Betty, you look like you were about to say something again. Okay. Hey, thank you all for coming. Hope you enjoyed tonight. We get into, tonight was more or less setting the stage. Next week, particularly when we start getting into the symbols and numbers and the language of Revelation, this is where it starts to get. You're going to see me nerd out next week, and I'm hoping that that my enjoyment of this kind of study of it is infectious. And just for the fun of it, here's another bit of homework. Is if you could, I don't know if it's on Netflix or not. John, I don't know if you can check that. See if you can see the movie Ready Player One. It's science fiction. It's set about in 2045 or so. But it is the best modern example of what apocalyptic literature feels like. And the trouble is that unless you might get some of the symbols, but if that movie was like, anybody who's roughly in there anywhere from 45 to 55 age range, but somewhat broader than Particularly if you were aware of the pop culture of the 1980s. It will make you may get more out of it, but it's fun.
What
Could
was
you
the name
repeat the
again?
name of the movie?
It's
Yeah.
called Ready Player One, directed by Steven Spielberg himself.
Ready Player One.
Ready Player One.
About playing
And-
computer games.
Yeah, and it is about computer games and virtual reality. But it is both literally and it is metaphorically on many different levels an Easter egg hunt.
Mhm. Yeah.
Would be a good way. Like I'm seeing Sue, not like Sue's seen it.
Yeah.
And but it shows the kind of all the different things in terms of how the symbology works. But the only trouble is that if you weren't aware of those particular pop culture references during the 80s, they might go over your head, but you may recognize some of them. Like I don't know if you ever watched Looney Tunes. There's a scene where if you're looking for it, you see Marvin the Martian walk by from Looney Tunes, for example. And it's just that those kinds of things, and so you may get something out of it. You might like the film for what it is, and you may have no idea what it's about. Could be either, but I found it to be fun. Plus, it's a Spielberg film, so he knows. Like this is the same guy. He knows how to make a movie. And it also isn't. Anyway, I'll just leave it. But it doesn't have anything to do with Revelation except for the style of the style and the symbols help with that. So okay.
Okay.
Anyway, thank you so much. We'll see you next week. This is still recording. Yep. And so what I'll do is I will post. I'm actually going to just stop the recording now. Just stop the recording now.